Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary films, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at klassiki.online. Today, I'll be speaking about the wild world of early Soviet film and the fate of the avant-garde with Ian Christie. Ian Christie is a film historian, curator, and broadcaster. He's written many wonderful books on subjects as diverse as Powell and Pressburger, Martin Scorsese, and Terry Gilliam. You may be familiar with his voice from his regular contributions to radio and television on all things cinematic. Ian has also written and edited a number of groundbreaking works on early Soviet film, and Sergei Eisenstein in particular. This year he's edited another fascinating volume about a neglected corner of Soviet film history, a centenary anthology about a remarkable filmmaking collective known as the Factory of the Eccentric Actor, or FEX. And that book is entitled Eccentrism Turns 100, FEX and the Early Soviet Avant-Garde. I'll be speaking with Ian about FEX and his decades-long efforts to bring the world of early Soviet film to life for modern audiences. If you're interested in finding out more, then you can purchase Ian's book today, and you can read an exclusive extract on the Klassiki Journal. Both links are in the show description. Ian Christie, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So, a few basic facts to start us off with. FEX, this is a Russian acronym. It stands for the Factory of the Eccentric Actor. And this was a theatre and later film collective that came together in what was then Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, in the early 1920s, led by a young Ukrainian duo, Grigory Kozintsev and Leonid Trauberg. So, first things first, who were Kozintsev and Trauberg? How did they meet? How did they come together in Petrograd? And how did FEX evolve into a filmmaking outfit in the first place?
Well, Kozintsev and Trauberg were indeed two lads from Ukraine. Leonid Trauberg was born in Odessa, and Kozintsev was born in Kiev. They didn't know each other. Why should they, when they were kids in Ukraine? But they both were determined to make their mark. They arrived in Petrograd, which was in a very odd state because Petrograd had been renamed, St. Petersburg renamed Petrograd at the beginning of the war, the Great War, to make it sound less German. And it had been the capital, of course, of Imperial Russia, but it was no longer the capital because Lenin had moved the capital after the revolution to Moscow. So things in Petrograd were a bit sort of a bit tough. It had lost its raison d'etre, and of course everything was in desperately short supply. Firewood, food, everything. These two kids realized that they wanted to do something to draw attention to themselves. And so they got access to a theater in the center of Petrograd, and they put on a show. And the show was a kind of send-up of a famous Russian, Ukrainian classic, The Wedding by Gogol. It bore no relation to the original, and most of the performance seems to have consisted of them insulting the audience. They had an audience, but consisted of a lot of theater people from Petrograd, and they spent a lot of time kind of shouting at them, saying, down with academic theaters, and praising popular culture coming in from the West. And right from the start, they're clearly addicted to American serials, the sort of Perils of Pauline, Exploits of Elaine type serial. They love these. They've been watching them. That's their immediate point of reference. They also have heard about this character called Chaplin. And at the very first performance, Kozintsev apparently stood up and said, I've heard about this extraordinary actor, comedian. Everyone's talking about him in the West. I don't know anything more about him, but boom, this was Chaplin. So those were the things that I think that really, they clung to, and they felt that there were lessons to be learned by revolutionary Russians if they watched American serials and watched Chaplin's movies. And that, I think, was their inspiration.
Chaplin was, I mean, American silent comedy, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, but Chaplin in particular was such a huge figure in early Soviet film more broadly, wasn't he? I mean, that blend of physical comedy and pathos was something that Soviet directors were kind of chasing for a long time and never quite getting there.
They were absolutely in love with a version of Chaplin, which I think was, their own version. When you look at the graphics, and there were so many magazines produced at this time which had amazing drawings of Chaplin, they've turned Chaplin into something very very Russian or very Soviet, even constructivist. So there were lots of images of Chaplin which may not correspond to our image of Chaplin, but I think they kind of invented their own Chaplin. They even talked about Chaplinism. And it was, as you say, it was a great cult in early Soviet Russia because it seemed to stand for irreverence. And this was a society that was throwing off the shackles, the traditions of reverence. And that's why, the idea of an eccentric actor, eccentric performance was so appealing to people like Kozintsev and Trauberg and their audiences.
I mean, you mentioned the kind of straitened material circumstances in Petrograd after the First World War. What was the artistic atmosphere in the city at the time, beyond obviously these Western imports in cinema and popular culture? What was the cultural or artistic ambience in which Fex and Kozintsev and Trauberg were working?
Well, there was a lot going on. People might have been starving and freezing, which mostly they were, I think. But there's an incredible amount of activity going on amongst literary people. There were several generations of writers who were extremely active, willing to turn up at the theatre, willing to declaim from the stage. There was a lot of publishing going on, although the paper is it's amazing that any of it has survived. It's very poor paper, but people were knocking out pamphlets. And Victor Shklovsky, one of the great writers of the period, talks about seeing a poster for the Fex frozen to the wall, which I think gives you a real sense of what life was like in Petrograd.
It's a very symbolic image.
It is.
I remember reading that in the 1920s, there was an explosion in pamphleteering and poetry because there wasn't enough paper for a novel, but there was enough paper for a punchy poem.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest thing of all was to stand up on the stage in a theatre, and there were a lot of theatres in Petrograd, small and large, and declaim from the stage. And so I think exactly as you say, because producing proper books was really not on the cards at this time. Pamphlets, things stuck to the wall, and just performance, declamation. These were the preferred modes.
And then that gets transmuted, if you like, into cinema in something like Fex.
Well, Kozintsev and Trauberg put on essentially 2 shows. And I think after that, they just decided that putting on shows was too ephemeral. And you might as well put your effort into making movies, because movies were what had inspired them. So in a sense, they were following their instinct that this was a moment when movies made more sense. So they wrote a script, didn't get any backing for it. Then they wrote another script with The Adventures of Oktyabrina, very much modeled on American serials, with people careering all over the famous monuments of Petersburg, up on the dome of St. Isaac's, doing daredevil stunts, apparently. And that really, they saw that was the way forward. And from that moment onwards, Trauberg says, they didn't think any more about theatre. They thought, we are going to make films. And they formed themselves into, I suppose it was a kind of collective. The reason why they're the factory of the eccentric actor is because they offered classes. And strangely enough, film schools, very informal film schools, were all the rage at this time, not only in Soviet Russia, but all over the world. People were offering to initiate young people into the mysteries of being a film actor or a film writer or something like that. So they were joining a worldwide enthusiasm for getting into movies.
Yes, I was going to ask next. So this name label FEX, the factory of the eccentric actor, this first comes up, as I understand it, in a pair of manifestos from the early 1920s, and we do get this term Eccentrism applied at the time and later on. But is this something we can define? Is this a discernible movement or tendency? Does it have any principles beyond irreverence and madcap tomfoolery? What does it mean to be a member of this factory? What does it mean to be eccentric?
Well, the front page of the 1922 manifesto, salvation in the trousers of the eccentric. So I think that means an eccentric who is like a clown. And Klauberg writes a piece for one of the Petrograd magazines about the wide trousers of the clown, the red clown. So circus was also something that was very popular in Russia, and not really part of our culture, but very very active and cheap and accessible. And so 4 blasts on a whistle, they say on the front of their manifesto, for the actor, from emotion to the machine, the technique from circus, the psychology head over heels. For the director, maximum number of devices, inventions, the turbine of rhythms. And so you get the sense that they're heavily into sort of machine imagery, and they're heavily against the great traditions of Russian tragic theatre. And they insult everybody in sight, all the great names of Petersburg or Petrograd theatre. They systematically insult. We don't want anguish, emotion. We want people doing cartwheels. And they feel this is revolutionary. They feel that modernizing Russia is essentially, as far as they're concerned, that's what the revolution has been about. It's about modernity, bringing modernity to a country that is still very 19th century, still very sunk in tradition.
So you said that we could loosely describe this as a collective. Who were some of their most important collaborators? Who were the cinematographers? Who was doing the production design? Who else was on board?
Well, they've had some actors who really came from the musical or from the circus, but they also had youngsters like themselves who wanted to be film actors. And if you take one example, for instance, would be Gerasimov. So Gerasimov comes from the Sticks, arrives in Petrograd, joins their group, takes a few lessons, does a few daredevil stunts, appears in almost all their early films, and then later he becomes a grand old man of Soviet cinema. So you could see it as a kind of rite of passage where youngsters who have a burning ambition but no great training make their way through this outfit. Their cameraman is Moskvin, and Moskvin is I think he's a figure who's not really had the attention that he should have had. He joins them about halfway through the mid-1920s. He's incredibly short-sighted. Everybody comments on how short-sighted he is, but he is a master of atmospheric lighting. And the reason why the earliest films that survive today, things like The Overcoat, SVD, and especially New Babylon, the reason why they look so fantastic is because of Moskvin's amazing camera work.
So you mentioned a couple of them there, but let's just talk about some of these films in more detail, because the films are amazing. I love these kind of few surviving silent films from FEX. So you mentioned their SVD, or the Society of Great Deeds. There's The Devil's Wheel, there's New Babylon. These are all from the mid to late 20s. I mean, which ones would you single out if people want to jump on YouTube after listening to this and delve in?
I think The Devil's Wheel is really the place to start. It's their earliest surviving film. But I always think that even if you see it in a terribly damaged copy, and that's all you'll find online,
Yeah.
pretty much. Take your pick. There are 3 or 4 different versions. They're all pretty poor, but something shines through. And I always think it's amazingly like a new wave French film of the 1960s. I mean, I
Right.
think
I see what you mean. Yeah.
there's a direct comparison, to my mind, between, Belmondo picks up Anna Karina in Godard's Breathless. That's 1960. It's exactly the same in The Devil's Wheel, where a sailor who's jumped ship, he's from the battle cruiser, the Aurora, picks up a girl at the fun fair, and they go off and spend the night together, riding the fun fair. And they meet up with all sorts of shady characters who are the underworld of Petrograd, really. Nowhere else in Soviet cinema do you see this side of life. What did people get up to at night? What did young people do? And I think there's no better way of connecting with the spirit of Fex than to start there.
Yeah, the lighting in that film, every time I see it, always strikes me. I was watching it again the other day with you, actually, when you were talking about your Fex book. And yeah, the effect, well, not effects is the wrong word, but just the striking kind of combination of artificial lighting and smoke and crowd work and the energy of the carnival or the circus coming together in that film. Like you say, it is very modern in the sense of kind of looking forward to things that would happen in films in the 50s and 60s. And then their most famous silent film would probably be New Babylon, which is from 1929. An amazing film. It's about the Paris Commune. It's set in 1871 during the France's war against Prussia, and it's about the world of the Parisian proletariat in this kind of militaristic and revolutionary fervor. So, I mean, what would you say to people who are embarking on a first-time viewing of New Babylon?
I'd say be prepared for a very different kind of historical film, and very again anti-heroic. I mean, if you compare it with what Eisenstein is doing, which of course is hugely better known. Eisenstein is making October, the official film of the October Revolution, at this time, really. And of course, he's got to take that very seriously, mostly, which he does. But Koznetsev and Trauberg are making a film about a famous attempted revolution. And that gives them a kind of license to be irreverent, quite harrowing in the end. But before that, there's a sense of, as you say, it's about the proletariat of Paris taking control of their own lives for a few short months. And Koznetsev and Trauberg actually got a chance to go to Paris. They could see with their own eyes, what they were going to recreate in the studio. And they went about it in an amazingly free and I think inspired way. I can't resist adding, of course, is if you can find a version of it online, I think you should be able to, with the original music by Shostakovich.
Oh, of course, yes.
Shostakovich was a friend of theirs. He was younger, a few years younger, and they brought him in to write a special score for it. Shostakovich knew Offenbach and, operetta composers like the back of his hand, very popular in Russia. And he does a kind of pastiche so that you get sort of Offenbach-like dance tunes laid over really quite harrowing scenes of street fighting. It's very, very interesting when you see the combination.
I'm always struck by when I watch New Babylon and then some of their later films, even like Alone from the early 30s. They pay so much attention to I guess you'd call it the material world and the kind of the sensual world of their characters. It's all about people encountering the world. There's this incredible opening sequence in New Babylon in the arcades, in the kind of shopping mall, to use an anachronistic term. And the kind of the phantasmagoria of all of this luxury and this fabric and textile and then the contrast with the world of the proletarians and the hardship and the tough physical labor. It's a sensibility that I don't think you find anywhere else in the period.
I think you describe it very well. It's they're very conscious of the material world, both the material world of the Soviet Russia that they're living in, but also of the past. When they do go into the history, as it were, they want to feel it, to feel its textures.
Right, that's it.
Smell it.
I mean, I mentioned there a film of theirs from the 30s. They did keep making films together, Kozintsev and Trauberg, although Fex itself kind of frittered away into the background a little bit into the 30s. I mean, what happened ultimately to Fex and what happened to Kozintsev and Trauberg? Because by the time of the Second World War, as I understand it, they were basically not making films together. They would go on to have separate careers after the Second World War to some extent or other. So, I mean, what happened to Fex and what happened to their partnership?
Well, they were incredibly successful in the 1930s, and this is the period of their careers that I think people know very little about in the West. But they made a trilogy of films about an imaginary character, Maxim, and Maxim became one of the first real heroes of Soviet cinema, Soviet sound cinema, because now we're in the sound era. So Boris Cherkov, who plays Maxim, became immensely recognizable. I mean, he's central to Soviet cinema of the 1930s. So they'd become absolutely, at the peak of Soviet propagandist cinema of the 1930s. But like a lot of other people, they fell foul of Stalin's paranoid obsessions. And in 1949, Trauberg was attacked because he was Jewish, essentially. He was named as the leader of a cosmopolitan group who were trying to undermine Soviet culture.
Right, so this was at the end of the 40s, the so-called anti-cosmopolitan campaigns, this kind of late Stalinist purge or attempted purge, because I guess it didn't manage to go as far as earlier purges had done, but which was specifically a kind of anti-Semitic campaign.
A lot of it seems to have been powered by anti-Semitism. And I mean, there were other elements to it too, but basically the people who were identified and harassed and driven out of their jobs were almost entirely Jewish. So that I think speaks for itself. And Trauberg found that he was instantly dropped by the studio that he had helped to create. And it was a very low point in his life. Kozintsev was more successful at reinventing himself. And if people know Kozintsev's name at all, they would probably know it from his late Shakespeare films. Right. He made two very, very famous Shakespeare films, Hamlet, which became a big hit in the West as well as at home, and King Lear. So he kind of reinvented himself very successfully and died in the 1970s. Trauberg had a much more difficult route. He didn't really get back into gear as a filmmaker, but he became a great teacher. And I was lucky enough to know him in the last decade of his life, and he was revered. He'd moved to Moscow. He would pop into Dom Kino, the great house of cinema, very often in the evening, and people would kind of come up to him just to hear him reminisce, to hear him talk. He was very sharp, very clear, very witty. And he had just such a storehouse of anecdotes and memories that he became a sort of like a walking encyclopedia.
So yeah, let's bring you into this story then, Ian. So you've worked on early Soviet film for a long time, and you traveled a lot in the Soviet Union, and also now obviously in the post-Soviet states. And you've done a lot to make material from the 1920s and 30s available for English language readers and viewers. And with Fex in particular, there's also this personal element to the story, because as you say, you did come to know and befriend Leonid Trauberg later in his life. So how did you first encounter Fex in their films? And then tell us more about the relationship that you were able to develop with Trauberg later in his life, and particularly about the trip to London that he made in the 1980s, which I know was a big deal for him, for you, and also for in terms of bringing his films, his and Koznetsev's films, to the attention of Western audiences?
Well, I kind of got interested in effects really before I knew very much about them. It just seemed such a wonderful upsurge of Soviet popular culture. And I discovered that Trauberg was still alive, and I got to meet him on a trip to Moscow. I was working for the British Film Institute, and part of my remit was to go to Russia and choose new Soviet films to be shown at the National Film Theatre in London. And I had the kind of, what I've now come to realize is the typical bad luck. I went in 1979, chose some wonderful new films, by people like Panfilov and Gogoberidze and others, and came back, wrote up the program, and then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So I find myself watching television one night, and the newsreader is saying, and the British government has retaliated by cancelling a visit by Soviet filmmakers. Wait a minute, we haven't invited anybody. I phoned up the Foreign Office, and they said, well, if you were going to invite anybody, don't. That was a very important lesson in the reality of cultural politics, because basically, although there was a lot of talk about blacklisting the Soviet Union, and of course we've all seen that recently in relation to the invasion of Ukraine, it is the case that relations do continue. And I was able to bring new Soviet films to London, and there were very divided opinions about whether we should be watching Soviet films. And I was able to befriend Trauberg and bring him to London in early 1983. People still had memories of the invasion of the Afghan war was still going on. That hadn't stopped.
Of course, yeah.
But what people were also realizing was that these people, these filmmakers, were not part of that machinery. They had nothing to do with it. And keeping cultural channels open, not only was it a good thing to do for the sake of culture, but it was also an important way to understand what was happening in Russia. And I think that's important. If you don't speak to Russian artists and don't watch their films and don't hear about their experiences of repression in the past, how can you understand what makes the country work? So I think that's the lesson I learned.
So turning back to the Soviet Union, the effects silent films that we were talking about there, they were made in a period that people I think are familiar with because it produced so much canonical work. Eisenstein, Vertov, Pudovkin, the big names of the avant-garde. They're still taught, I think, on most film courses. That these are kind of formative figures in film history. Fex is obviously less well known within that pack, that cohort. But what do you think Fex's place within that kind of famous Soviet avant-garde should be seen as? And how do you think they can help us to kind of recontextualize that famous period in Soviet film?
I think one of the most important things about Fex is not only have they been kind of pushed aside, if you like, by names like Eisenstein and Vertov, which conform more clearly to people's idea of what Soviet art should be. But what the Fex, the culture of Fex, especially in the 1920s, does is to remind us that these were young Soviet artists who, on the one hand, were very excited by modernism in the West, and at the same time, they also had a foot in the past. They knew a lot about traditional Russian popular culture. It didn't all stop dead with the revolution. They understood the history of bandit stories, which were hugely popular. That's what most people read in Russia in the 19th century. They read popular tales about famous bandits. Fex keep that tradition alive. And I think that's their value. They're like a kind of bridge between the traditional culture of Russia all the way back into the 19th, even the 18th century, and the modernity of which the Soviet Union was very much a part, as you say, in the 1920s and even in the 1930s.
I guess one of the issues there as well is the comparison with more familiar, more canonical directors for Western audiences, like, say, Sergei Eisenstein, who is someone you've written a lot about. So actually, let's move on to Eisenstein now, someone you've been working on for a long time. And he's also one of the most, pored over figures in film history. It feels like every single scrap of Eisensteinian kind of paraphernalia has been turned over at this point. I mean, what is there left to say about him, do you think, in 2024? And I guess also, how has your understanding of Eisenstein as a figure changed in the years that you've been working on him?
Well, I think that the key to understanding more of the real Eisenstein is really the memoirs he wrote, and it took a very, very long time for the full text, if you like, of a memoir that he was working on at the end of his life to appear. It's now a gigantic book. It's called Beyond the Stars, and it's only one version of how you might arrange his memoir, but it's full of unexpected, wicked, under the counter observations, memories, etc. But also, I think the drawings. Eisenstein was an obsessive draftsman. He drew constantly. I think he drew while he was talking to people. He drew almost automatically. And he would pick up a piece of paper. Often it was a scrap of paper or something he found in a hotel. And he would just start drawing on it. The drawings are gloriously obscene. They're so obscene that they're actually quite tricky to put in front of an innocent audience, and various exhibitions of them have had to have health warnings. You prepare, you may be shocked by it. So Eisenstein really let his unconscious, I suppose, loose in his drawings. And I feel that if you haven't engaged with the memoirs and the drawings, you haven't really seen Eisenstein in the round. So I suppose that's really changed my attitude to Eisenstein a lot over the years.
If people want to look into those drawings that you were just mentioning there, I should say that there was a wonderful kind of coffee book collection of them published in English and Russian a few years ago. I think it's called Eisenstein on Paper. And it contains hundreds of amazing and often, as you say, very obscene doodles, sketches, storyboards, cartoons, caricatures. It's really amazing. So just before we go, I'd love to ask you briefly about this new book that you've just edited about Vex, Eccentrism Turns 100. What was the thinking behind that, and how has it differed from other books that you've worked on the period?
I've done this book. It's little, well, it's not so little, but it's a short book about Vex, and the centerpiece of it is the original manifesto of 1922. But the way we've done it is you can see the original text, which is very eccentric, and you can read the translation on the facing page. And I do think it's quite important. This has really been something that's run through much of my life. I'm not in any sense a fluent Russian reader or speaker. I mean, I've learned quite a lot, but I'm by no means fluent. And I think it's important to preserve the sense that you can engage with this culture of Russian cinema, Soviet cinema, even if you're not a scholar of Russian. It's wonderful to have the help of people who have studied Russian, like yourself, and I've had the help of many other great scholars and Russian-born collaborators. But really, we want to keep things open for a much, much wider public. And I've done this little book about Vex really for the benefit of people who are not Russian readers. This gives you an entry into this world, I think, which I hope is exciting, welcoming, seductive even. It's for non-specialists, but I'm hoping it'll draw people in, because I do think that we shouldn't We shouldn't leave it entirely to people who have an academic interest in things Soviet and things Russian. We need them, we need their expertise, but we also need to keep it open for a much wider public. So I think a lot of my life has been devoted to trying to keep two-way channels of communication open. And I'd like to do that, especially in the present climate when, there's so much that turns us against Putin's Russia, quite rightly.
And like you say, Fex were so interested themselves in the idea of popular culture. It only makes sense that their work should be as accessible as possible.
Yeah, when Trauberg was in London, I remember walking down Piccadilly with him towards a party that we'd set up in Albany. And he looked up at Piccadilly, the first time he'd been in London, and he said, "This is a real city." And you knew that all his life he'd been engaged with aspects of English culture. To actually be in London in his own, when he was in his 80s, meant a huge amount to him. It gave him a sense of finally he had come home, as it were. And I think it's that internationalism which Fex stands for.
Well, Ian, thanks so much for taking the time to talk us through your adventures in Eccentricism, your adventures in Eisenstein and early Soviet film and everything else besides. And we'll put a link for people to have a look at your book on Fex in the show description. But Ian Christie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sam. Pleasure to talk through it all.